It was just past 7 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning in Hollow Creek, Alabama. The town was still draped in that sleepy hush, birds chirping, coffee brewing, church bells not yet ringing. No one expected the call that came in to 911 dispatch. 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, only breathing. Then, a trembling voice, female, weak, almost childlike. There's been a shooting. The dispatcher straightened in her chair. Ma'am, are you in danger? Who's been shot? A pause. Then the woman spoke again. Her voice cracked open, heavy with something deeper than fear. I shot my mother and my son. Time stopped. The dispatcher blinked, certain she had misheard. Before she could ask for clarification, the woman whispered something else, so softly, it nearly disappeared beneath the hum of the line. My mother. She was pregnant, with his baby. Silence. The dispatcher froze. Words failed. The air in the room turned to stone. Ma'am, what did you say? I said, my mother was pregnant with my son's child. And then, she hung up. Within 15 minutes, the first patrol unit arrived at a small powder blue house on Willow Street, nestled under two massive pecan trees. The swing on the front porch creaked in the breeze. A pair of church shoes sat neatly by the door. A hand-sewn American flag fluttered gently in the yard. From the outside, it looked like any other Southern grandmother's home. But what waited inside was anything but normal. It was the kind of scene that detectives would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Two bodies, one elderly woman, one young man, slumped face down at the dining table. They were both dressed in their Sunday best. Scrambled eggs sat uneaten on fine china. A jar of peach preserves still open. A wine glass lay shattered on the floor, crimson soaking into the rug. And there, huddled on the cold tile floor near the kitchen island, sat Naomi Price, 52 years old. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest. Her hands were shaking. In her lap was a handgun. Her eyes were bloodshot, swollen, vacant. When the officers asked her what had happened, she didn't try to run. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't even cry. She looked them dead in the eye and said, I couldn't let that baby be born. You don't understand. You can't understand. But if you want to understand what really happened in that house, you have to go back, 3 months back, to the morning Martha Bell collapsed in her kitchen, and everything in this picture-perfect family began to rot from the inside out. The moment Officer Derek Malone stepped through the front door of the small blue house on Willow Street, he knew something was deeply, terribly wrong. It wasn't just the blood. It wasn't even the bodies. It was the stillness. This wasn't just a house where people had died. It was a house where something unholy had happened. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. A gospel station was still playing softly from a radio on the kitchen counter. The kitchen itself looked like it had been frozen mid-morning, plates half-filled, forks in hand, napkins folded neatly on laps that were now lifeless. At the dining table, the two bodies sat slumped forward, as if they had simply fallen asleep. But the crimson pools beneath them told another story. Martha Bell, 91 years old, was slouched over her plate, pearls still perfectly fastened around her neck, her hair pinned in soft silver curls. Her thin hands were still resting gently on the table. Across from her was her 24-year-old grandson, Caleb Price, dressed in a crisp white button-down and khakis. He had been shot once, square in the chest. The bullet shattered his sternum and stopped his heart before he could even reach for his fork. The food on the table told its own twisted story. Scrambled eggs, cooked with bits of bell pepper. A jar of peach preserves half empty. Biscuits golden brown. Someone had taken the time to make this meal with care, and someone else had ended it with a bullet. On the wall above them, just behind the table, hung a simple embroidered frame. A cross-stitch in pink and gold. Family is God's greatest gift. The irony of it made Officer Malone's stomach turn. Just a few feet away, huddled on the tile floor, was Naomi Price, the daughter of the woman and the mother of the man. Her legs were drawn tightly to her chest. Her blouse was stained with sweat, blood, and something else, grief, maybe, madness. Her knuckles were white around the handgun resting limply in her lap. Her lips moved slowly as the officers approached. She wasn't talking to them. She was talking to herself. I didn't want to do it, but I had to. God help me, I had to. She didn't resist arrest. She didn't speak a word as they cuffed her hands and walked her out of the house. She just stared at the bodies and blinked, as if she still couldn't believe they were real. Neighbors stood in clusters along the sidewalk, robes pulled tight around their bodies, coffee mugs trembling in hand. Some of them had known Martha Bell for decades. To them, she was the church lady, the sweet, proper widow who baked banana bread for every funeral and always had a jar of homemade jam ready for the kids at Halloween. None of them could have imagined this. "I thought maybe she had a heart attack," said Mrs. Green from next door, her voice cracking. "But pregnant? And Caleb? I just know. No, that can't be true." But it was. The coroner confirmed it before sundown. Martha Bell was 3 months pregnant, and based on the DNA tests that followed, the baby was Caleb Price's. Back at the station, Naomi sat in a gray-walled interview room, hands trembling, eyes blank. Detectives asked if she wanted a lawyer. She shook her head. They asked her to explain what happened. And in a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for prayer, Naomi said, "I did it to stop something worse. You don't understand. You can't understand. What could drive a woman, any woman, to pull the trigger on her own mother and only child? What kind of horror takes root so deep in a home that it grows behind smiles, beneath Sunday dresses, and inside wombs that should have never been full again?" The answer wouldn't come from crime scene photos or autopsy reports. It wouldn't be found in ballistic evidence or timelines. No, to understand what happened in that house on Willow Street, you'd have to go back 3 months, to a hot July morning, to the smell of biscuits baking in a warm southern kitchen, to the moment when a 91-year-old woman, beloved, respected, and seemingly untouchable, collapsed on her tile floor, and a secret that had been rotting for years finally began to crack the surface. Sometimes, the most horrifying secrets are buried not in the shadows, but in plain sight, hiding behind a smile, a shared meal, or even a family name. For months, whispers of strange behavior had swirled quietly around the house. Neighbors noticed it first, the odd way Eleanor looked at Joseph, not with the gentle affection of a grandmother, but with something darker, possessive, obsessive. Some thought it was dementia, others brushed it off as grief after her husband's passing. But inside the home, things were unraveling fast. Joseph, now 26, had all but abandoned any semblance of normal life. He dropped out of school, quit his part-time job, and rarely left the house. Eleanor kept him close, smothering him with attention, praise, and increasingly, control. She cooked all his meals. She did his laundry. She even began sleeping in the same bed, claiming she was afraid to be alone at night. It wasn't until one stormy evening in October that the truth began to surface. Joseph's cousin, Mia, only a year younger than him, came by unannounced to drop off some old family photos. She hadn't seen him in over 6 months. When Joseph opened the door, she barely recognized him. He looked pale, exhausted, hollowed out like a ghost of the boy she once knew. "Joseph, are you okay?" she asked. He didn't answer, just nodded and let her in. But what she saw inside shocked her to her core. The living room was spotless, too spotless. Every cushion aligned, every photo frame gleaming. On the wall were several portraits of Joseph and Eleanor, framed like wedding pictures. There was even a photo of them holding hands under a rose arch in the garden. That's when Eleanor walked in, dressed in a silk nightgown. Her expression froze when she saw Mia. "Oh," she said, voice low and curt. "I didn't know we were expecting company." Mia forced a smile. "I was just dropping something off." The tension was suffocating. Joseph stood silently, eyes darting between the two women. Eleanor's hand found his arm and clutched it tightly. Mia knew something was off. Deeply, horrifically off. That night, she called her mother. Something's not right with Grandma. And Joseph, he looked like he was trapped. But by then, it was already too late. Just 2 weeks later, Eleanor made a shocking announcement to the family during a rare dinner gathering. She stood at the head of the table, raised a trembling glass of wine, and said with eerie calm, "I have wonderful news. Joseph and I are expecting." The room went silent. Someone dropped a fork. Joseph didn't speak. He just stared at his plate like he wanted to disappear. Eleanor beamed. "We're having a baby." Laughter bubbled from one corner of the room, followed by a choking cough. Everyone thought it was a sick joke. But when Eleanor placed a hand gently over her belly, smiling with maternal pride, the horror began to settle in. "What the hell are you talking about?" barked Joseph's uncle, Richard. "Are you out of your mind?" Joseph finally stood up. "It's true," he muttered, barely audible. "We're having a child." Mia ran from the table in tears. The next week, Joseph was disowned by half the family. Eleanor cut ties with the rest herself. She claimed they were jealous of their love. They moved out of the family house and into a secluded cottage in the woods, away from judging eyes, away from civilization. But isolation didn't bring peace. It only brought darkness. Eleanor's pregnancy, at age 91, was medically impossible by all logical standards. But somehow, she insisted it was real. She grew fatter by the day, her belly distended. She kept referring to the baby in every conversation, even talking to it aloud while cooking or gardening. Joseph, now visibly deteriorating, no longer resisted. He obeyed. He served. And slowly, he began to unravel. He started talking to people who weren't there. He'd sit in the backyard for hours, whispering to himself. The spark in his eyes had died. And then, the murders began. Sometimes, the most terrifying monsters don't live under our beds. They sit at the head of our family table, smiling. The days after Maria's confession to Carla felt like a slow descent into madness. Carla was no longer the same. Her warm eyes had turned cold, her laughter disappeared, and in its place was a silence that carried the weight of unbearable shame. Every time she looked at her son David, it was like staring into the face of her darkest mistake. She still loved him, but how could she continue to live a lie that had already destroyed everything? Even in their small, tight-knit town, whispers had begun to circulate. Neighbors looked at Carla with suspicion, with judgment, even fear. She knew they didn't know the full truth, but they didn't need to. Rumors were more powerful than facts. And in the shadows, someone had been watching. A man named Vernon Clay had recently returned to the town after serving 12 years in prison for manslaughter. He was a volatile, unpredictable man, and he had once been in love with Carla. Or so he thought. But she'd rejected him long ago, choosing instead a life he saw as morally superior to his own. When Vernon heard the murmurs about Carla's incestuous child, something in him snapped. He felt betrayed, enraged. How dare she turn him down? Only to raise a child born from what the town now called a sin against nature? One evening, Vernon showed up outside Carla's home. She opened the door and found him there, drunk, sweating, shaking with fury. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "You think you can pretend like you ain't just as messed up as the rest of us? You made a baby with your own blood, Carla." Carla slammed the door in his face, heart pounding in terror. But the damage had already been done. The next morning, someone spray-painted the word monster across the front of her house in red. Bright, loud, unforgiving. She didn't even have the strength to wash it off. Maria watched all of this unfold with an increasing sense of dread. She had thought that by finally telling Carla the truth, they could move forward, perhaps even heal. But instead, it had opened a wound that would never close. And David, sweet, confused David, sensed that something was terribly wrong. Kids at school had started mocking him. One even threw a rock at him, calling him a bastard born of sin. That night, he asked Carla, "Mom, why don't people like me anymore?" Carla broke down. She couldn't take it anymore. The shame, the whispers, the word monster staring at her every morning. She called Maria. "I can't do this, Mom. I can't live like this. I wish I never knew. I wish you never told me." Maria, now 91, sat silently on the phone. She could hear her daughter's sobs, raw, guttural cries of a woman breaking apart from the inside out. But she had no words left. Because deep down, Maria feared what might come next. She feared Carla wasn't just mourning her past. She feared Carla was planning her end. The footage continued to play, static dancing across the screen like ghosts refusing to rest. Detective Marissa leaned in, her hand trembling as she increased the volume. Nurse Terry Owens appeared in frame. Late 30s, stern face, clipboard always in hand. She stood frozen as she examined the frail woman in the wheelchair. Then, in a voice just barely audible over the hum of the surveillance mic, Nurse Owens whispered, "Martha, this doesn't make sense. You're pregnant." Martha Bellamy didn't answer. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, not out of confusion, but out of something darker, something rehearsed. "Expected. Who did this to you?" the nurse asked, voice cracking. Still silence. And then, Martha looked up. With slow, deliberate breath, she spoke 5 words that chilled Marissa to the bone. "He said it was love." The footage cut out. Marissa sat motionless in her chair. Pregnant. 91. The words clanged in her mind like broken bells. She opened the patient files. How had no one noticed? How had this been hidden? Then she found it, a falsified medical report, signed off by a doctor who didn't exist. The original blood work had been replaced. The scans erased. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury this. And the bigger question loomed. Who was he? Who could possibly have gotten a 91-year-old woman pregnant, without a single soul noticing? Marissa wasn't sure what was more disturbing, the act itself, or how meticulously it had been covered up. She knew this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a conspiracy, and whoever was behind it had already killed to keep it buried. And they would kill again. Detective Marissa didn't sleep that night. The image of Martha Bellamy's hollow eyes haunted her. So did the question, who was he? The files, the silence, the smuggled footage, it all pointed toward a truth so grotesque it barely seemed real. By morning, she had a name. Dr. Peter Langston, the head physician at Brightmoor Correctional, long celebrated for his humanitarian work with aging inmates. No criminal record, clean credentials, praised in state reports. But as Marissa dug deeper, she found cracks. A string of internal complaints buried under administrative errors. 3 nurses who had transferred out within a month, 2 of whom refused to speak. The third, Nurse Terry Owens, was missing, disappeared just days after filing her resignation. Marissa visited the prison one final time, this time with a warrant and a forensic team. Cameras were seized. Staff questioned. DNA samples taken. The match was immediate. Dr. Langston was the father of Martha Bellamy's unborn child. The truth hit the prison like a storm. He had been sedating inmates, using his access to perform artificial inseminations on vulnerable, elderly women. Some pregnancies had been terminated quietly. Others had miscarried. Martha was the only one who had survived long enough to speak. Dr. Langston was arrested while giving a lecture at a state university, ironically on ethics in elder care. His face showed no remorse, only frustration. He never spoke a word to investigators. He didn't need to. The evidence told the story. So did the bodies of 2 nurses, discovered buried in a shallow field outside his country home. One was Nurse Terry Owens. The other, a young orderly who had tried to alert a social worker and vanished soon after. The state shut Brightmoor down within the week. Martha Bellamy passed away 3 months later, her body too fragile to carry the pregnancy to term. But before she died, she gave a final testimony, whispered into Marissa's recorder, her voice breaking. They thought no one would care what happened to an old woman. But someone did. You. Marissa played those words every night for weeks. In a system that had failed, one woman had dared to look, dared to dig. And even though justice came too late for some, it came. And it spoke. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in quiet cells, in broken whispers, in eyes that finally closed knowing they'd been seen. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, true crime fanatics, and heartbroken family members filled every inch of space. The air was thick with tension, and the silence before the verdict felt louder than any scream. Elijah Branson sat motionless at the defense table. His face, once proud and smug, now looked hollow. Time had drained the arrogance from his features, replacing it with a twisted mixture of dread and denial. Dressed in an ill-fitting suit, hands cuffed tightly, he looked nothing like the man who had once manipulated 3 generations of his family into silence, chaos, and bloodshed. Across the room, Martha Lynn, now in her early 90s, sat in a wheelchair, hands folded in her lap, her head down. She wasn't there for Elijah. She was there for her great-grandchildren, for the broken souls of her daughters, and for the ghost of a life she should have had if she had escaped when she first sensed evil creeping into her home. And then came the moment. All rise, the bailiff said, and the judge entered, face stoic. The jury had reached a unanimous verdict after just 6 hours of deliberation. A hush fell over the room. The foreman stood. In the case of the state versus Elijah Branson, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A gasp swept through the courtroom. Some cried. Others clapped softly. And Elijah? He blinked. Once. Twice. Then he let out a long, guttural exhale, like the final breath of a man who had nothing left to hide behind. But the judgment didn't stop there. He was also found guilty of incest, rape, sexual assault of a minor, witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Each charge read aloud was another nail in his spiritual coffin. The judge stared at Elijah with something close to disgust. "You are a predator, Mr. Branson. You corrupted your own bloodline, destroyed the innocence of children who trusted you, and tried to erase the evidence with blood. This court sentences you to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole." Boom. Just like that, justice thundered down. But even as Elijah was led away, there was no celebration, no cheering, only a quiet, heavy release, like everyone in that courtroom had been holding their breath for decades and could finally let it out. In the months that followed, Martha Lynn passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her last wish? That her story be told. That the darkness hidden behind closed doors no longer be a secret. That no other woman, child, or family be lost in the silence that once nearly swallowed hers. And so, her story lives on, not just in court records, not just in hushed whispers, but in every survivor who dares to speak the truth, in every family who chooses to break the cycle, and in every viewer who watches and says, "No more." When the sun finally rose on that cold December morning, Elijah Freeman was no longer just a father in mourning. He was a man with a mission. The final name on his list was etched deeper in his heart than any other. Chief Harold Beckett, the man who had orchestrated it all from behind the safety of his title and badge. Beckett wasn't just the head of the precinct. He was the puppet master, the one who'd buried complaints, silenced whistleblowers, and ensured every crooked officer under his command could walk away clean. And now, he was the last one left. Elijah knew Beckett wouldn't be easy to get to. The chief was surrounded by layers of security, and his every movement was calculated. But Elijah had been a soldier, a strategist, and more than anything else, he was a father who'd lost everything. He watched Beckett's home for days. A mansion in the hills, with private security, cameras on every corner, and a gated perimeter. But Elijah wasn't intimidated. He'd come too far, sacrificed too much. The system had already taken Amaya. He wasn't going to let it keep the truth buried. On the 7th night, under cover of darkness and rain, Elijah made his move. He breached the back fence, bypassed security alarms with tools he once used in service to his country, and slipped through the shadows like a ghost. Every step he took toward that house was fueled by memories of Amaya's laughter, her courage, the way she fought for others even when the world turned against her. Inside the house, Beckett was in his study, sipping bourbon, completely unaware of the reckoning coming for him. Elijah stepped into the room, gun in hand. Beckett looked up, startled. "Freeman." Elijah didn't yell. He didn't threaten. His voice was cold, controlled. "You remember my daughter?" he asked. Beckett stood slowly, his hands raising instinctively. "Elijah, listen, I listened." Elijah cut him off. "When she cried for justice, when she begged your officers to protect her, when she trusted the system you corrupted, and you let her bleed in that street like she didn't matter." Beckett's voice trembled. "You don't have to do this. She deserved better," Elijah whispered. "They all did." And with that, a single shot rang out. The bullet found its mark, and Chief Beckett collapsed, the weight of his sins crashing down with him. Elijah stood there for a moment, the silence deafening. Not triumphant, not proud, just empty. Because justice, when delayed for too long, doesn't bring peace. Only truth. He walked out of the house and placed his weapon on the ground as police sirens screamed in the distance. He raised his hands, surrendering not because he regretted what he'd done, but because the world needed to hear the story. He would not be painted as just another cop killer. No, they would know who he was. A father, a man broken by a system designed to protect, and a reminder that silence, in the face of injustice, always comes at a cost. Some stories don't end. They echo across families, cities, and time. After the trial, after the sentencing, after the headlines faded and the courtroom emptied, what remained was the aftermath. The hollow silence that crept into every room the victims once filled. The shattered trust that no justice could fully repair. Monica Ellis was buried in a quiet cemetery on the edge of town. Her grave, simple and unassuming, is often visited by her sister, her daughter, and by strangers who read her story and couldn't forget her name. They leave flowers, notes, apologies. She became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of how betrayal can live closest to us. As for Damon King, He sits in a maximum security prison in upstate New York, alone, forgotten by those who once called him friend or brother. In interviews, he's cold, detached, still blaming everyone but himself. There is no remorse in his eyes, only the gnawing bitterness of a man who destroyed everything and learned nothing. Tasha, Monica's sister, never returned to her old life. She started a nonprofit in her sister's name, advocating for domestic violence victims and pushing for better oversight of parolees and violent offenders. In every interview, her voice shakes, but she speaks, because silence is what got Monica killed. And little Ava, she's growing up, slowly, carefully, surrounded by love and therapy and reminders that she is not to blame for the chaos that tore her mother from this world. Her drawings, once dark and jumbled, now bloom with color. She's starting to smile again. A different smile, but a real one. In the end, Monica's story is not just about how she died, but about how we failed her. Failed to believe her. Failed to protect her. And how many other Monicas walk among us, unseen, unheard, until it's too late. So if you're listening now, don't let this be just another story. Let it be a call. Check on your loved ones. Believe survivors. Trust your instincts. And if someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Because sometimes, the people we let in are the ones who tear us apart from the inside. And sometimes, justice comes too late. But remembering, that part's on us. Forever.